Texas, October 1945. Special Agent Thomas. Crawford stepped off the train in Amarillo with a leather briefcase in one hand and instructions from Washington folded neatly inside his coat. The panhandle wind cut across the platform, dry and restless, carrying the smell of dust and rail grease. Crawford adjusted his hat and took in the flat horizon stretching beyond the station, a place where distance swallowed sound and secrets didn't echo the way they did back east. His orders were unusual. 3 German women under federal custody were expecting children. The fathers were American civilians, ranchers, cowboys, men approved to supervise enemy labor programs. No violence had been reported, no security breach identified. But something had happened out there between barbed wire and open land that Washington could no longer ignore. Crawford had spent years tracking sabotage and espionage. Tisques wasanti, about enemies hiding in shadows. It was about how rules written for war had failed to account for what happens after war ends. The first case surfaced quietly in September at the Hereford Processing Center. Dr. Margaret Walsh, the camp physician, noted the condition during a routine medical examination. Elise Hartmann, 23 years old, former telephone operator from Stuttgart, classified auxiliary personnel, captured in April, approximately 16 weeks along. Dr. Walsh wrote it down with clinical precision, but she did not miss the way Elise's hands tightened against the edge of the examination table, or how her gaze fixed on the ceiling as if answers might be written there. "How long have you known?" Walsh asked gently. Elise hesitated. Her English was careful but fluent now, shaped by months of forced proximity and necessity. 2 months, she said. Then, after a pause, maybe longer. The father was not mentioned. He didn't need to be. Protocol required reporting. Dr. Walsh filed it that afternoon. Within days, 2 more cases emerged. Anna Becker, 26, former shipping clerk from Bremen. 3 months along. Katharina Vogel, 21, previously assigned to a medical unit in Berlin. Just over 8 weeks. All 3 women had been assigned to ranch work through civilian labor programs. All 3 had formed connections beyond what regulations permitted. Dr. Walsh compiled the reports and sent them up the chain. On October 2nd, the War Department received the file. By October 5th, Thomas Crawford was ordered south. The drive from Amarillo to Hereford took him through land that felt almost prehistoric in its openness. Grassland rolled uninterrupted to the horizon. Windmills turned slowly. Cattle moved like scattered punctuation marks across the plain. Crawford, raised in Philadelphia streets, felt the weight of that emptiness press in on him. At the processing center, Dr. Walsh met him with a measured calm. "These women have been through enough," she said as he laid photographs across her desk. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't force." "That's what I need to confirm," Crawford replied. "The law doesn't care about intention," he added, though even as he said it, he felt the inadequacy of the sentence. The first ranch lay southwest of town. Sam Mackenzie met Crawford by a fence line. Cedar posts stacked nearby. 34 years old, weathered hands. No attempt to deny what the agent had come for. "I knew someone would come," Mackenzie said quietly. Inside the farmhouse, coffee steamed between 3 cups. Elise had lived here, worked here, eaten meals at this table. She wasn't an enemy, Martha Mackenzie said steadily. She was a person who lost everything. Crawford took notes, his pen slowing as the story unfolded, not of secrecy, but of openness, of grief, of people choosing connection in a place where isolation could eat a man alive. At the second ranch, Robert Harrison spoke of loneliness and sleepless nights, and a house that still remembered his wife. At the third, 2 brothers explained a life built on shared responsibility, one that simply made room when someone broke and needed it. Nothing fit the categories Crawford had been trained to enforce. Over the next days, he interviewed the women themselves. Elise spoke calmly, without bitterness. "I was given a choice," she said. "I stayed because I wanted to." Anna spoke of finding hope where she had expected only survival. Katharina spoke last, carefully, about exhaustion, about kindness without judgment. Crawford. Crawford listened. In the evenings, He sat in the diner in Hereford, hearing townspeople argue quietly over coffee. Some spoke of rules and loyalty. Others spoke of decency. By the time Crawford returned to his hotel room to draft his report, the case had shifted. Yes, regulations had been violated, but what he had found wasn't exploitation. It was what happens when war ends, before people know how to stop being human. Washington did not respond. At first, Thomas Crawford treated the silence as routine. The War Department was overwhelmed. Europe was in ruins. Millions of men were returning home. Paper moved slowly when wars ended. Everyone knew that, but silence had weight. And as days passed, the weight grew heavier. Crawford remained in Amarillo longer than his orders required. Each morning, he went downstairs to the hotel lobby, nodded to the clerk, and asked if any messages had arrived. Each morning, the answer was the same. Nothing yet. He reread his report twice a day. The facts did not change. 3 German women, 3 pregnancies. American civilians. Technical violations. No evidence of force, manipulation, or security compromise. His recommendation had been clear. Administrative resolution, no prosecutions. It should have been straightforward. But Washington was quiet. On the 8th day, Crawford called a colleague in Dallas. A man he trusted. A man who understood how Washington really worked. The colleague paused before answering. "If they're silent," he said carefully, "it usually means someone doesn't like the options." "What kind of options?" Crawford asked. "The kind where nobody wins." The line went quiet again. Crawford understood then that silence wasn't neutrality. It was pressure. Silence meant the file could be buried to avoid embarrassment. Silence meant blame could be reassigned. Silence meant someone higher up was deciding whether Crawford himself had become part of the problem. He imagined the possibilities: a scapegoat investigator, a quiet disciplinary transfer, a note in a permanent file that never quite went away. Silence could protect people or prepare to burn them. While Washington delayed laugh in Hereford, continued under a low, constant tension. At the processing center, Elise Hartman became increasingly careful about everything she did. What's Said? How long she stayed in town? Who she spoke to? Dr. Walsh noticed it immediately. Elise's medical condition required regular monitoring. Pregnancy under stress was unpredictable. Dr. Walsh documented every visit meticulously. Knowing records could become protection if decisions turned hostile. There were whispers. Someone said Germany might formally request remaining nationals back. Someone said residency permissions could be reevaluated. Someone said the camp was only one signature away from enforcing removal. None of it was confirmed. That was the problem. Uncertainty became its own form of control. Crawford's report did not go to Washington immediately. For 3 nights, it sat unfinished on the desk in his hotel room while the panhandled wind rattled the windows and freight trains passed through Amarillo in the dark. He rewrote sentences, crossed out conclusions, then brought them back again. The facts were simple. The implications were not. Federal regulations were explicit. Prisoners under custody were not to form personal relationships with civilians. The rule existed to prevent abuse, coercion, and compromise. Yet nothing Crawford had documented in Hereford fit those categories cleanly. No threats, no leverage, no security. Only choices made in circumstances no regulation had anticipated. On the 4th morning, he mailed the report. Washington responded with silence. At first, Crawford told himself it was procedural delay. Paperwork moved slowly. The war had just ended. Everyone was busy closing files, not opening new ones. But days passed, then a full week. Silence hardened into something else. He called a contact at the regional office. The man lowered his voice before answering. "If they don't answer," he said, "it's worse than no." Crawford stared at the phone after the line went dead. Silence could mean the file was being buried. Silence could mean someone higher up was deciding who would take the blame. Silence could mean the Bureau was protecting the outcome or preparing to burn the process. He realized then that delay itself was a kind of threat. Meanwhile, life in Hereford did not pause to wait for Washington. At the processing center, Elise Hartman continued reporting to the infirmary each morning. Dr. Walsh monitored her closely, documenting everything with extra care. Pregnancy under these circumstances carried risks, physical strain, stress, uncertainty. There were rumors whispered in hallways, half-formed and never confirmed. Germany might request repatriation. Policy could change. Permission could be revoked. Elise heard the whispers and said nothing. She folded baby clothes in the evenings, quietly, methodically, as if preparation itself might anchor her future in place. Anna Becker faced a different kind of uncertainty. Her marriage to Robert Harrison was legal, but acceptance was not automatic. There were looks at the registry office, a pause at the church door before a hymn was handed to her. Nothing overt, nothing confrontational, just enough distance to remind her that belonging was conditional. Katharina Vogel encountered resistance in quieter ways. Questions framed as curiosity, invitations that stopped coming, conversations that ended a little too quickly. The Callahan brothers noticed before she did. "She's allowed to be here," Daniel said once, more to himself than anyone else. Allowed, not welcomed, not secure. The understanding lingered over all three women. Nothing was guaranteed. When Washington finally responded, the decision came without ceremony. No prosections, administrative sanctions only. Labor programs adjusted. Cases closed quietly. Relief came. But it was fragile. The ranches were removed from approved assignment lists. Formal reprimands were issued. No press statements. No hearings. No acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had occurred. The message was clear. This outcome was tolerated, not endorsed. Years passed. In 1952, Crawford returned to the Panhandle on unrelated business. He drove past the ranches without stopping. From the road, everything appeared ordinary. Fences intact, children playing, horses moving lazily through corrals. Continuity disguised the risk that had once hovered over all of it. That Evan Inge sat alone at a diner counter, stirring his coffee while the radio murmured in the background. He thought about the report again, about the moment he had chosen, phrasing carefully, softened conclusions, emphasized context. He had not enforced the law. He had interpreted it. The realization sat heavier than he expected. That choice had followed him, quietly, persistently, into every investigation since. Crawford understood then that he was no longer a neutral observer. He had crossed an internal line the moment he recognized that strict enforcement would have caused more harm than restraint. And he knew something else, with absolute clarity. If the same case crossed his desk again, different names, different town, same circumstances, he would make the same choice. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He finished his coffee, paid at the register, and stepped back into the wind. The file was closed. The consequences were not. By winter, the town of Hereford had learned how to speak without speaking. People still nodded on sidewalks. Church bells still rang on Sundays. The diner still served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But conversations shifted when certain names came up. Pauses grew longer. Smiles became conditional. The investigation was officially over. But consequences had not finished unfolding. For Elise Hartman, the weeks before the birth passed slowly. Each day brought a new calculation. How much should she say? How visible should she be? Would be noticed help or remind someone she was still technically removable? Dr. Walsh scheduled additional checkups, citing precautionary care. The notes were careful, precise, and intentionally thorough. Every visit created a paper trail. Every heartbeat recorded became a quiet argument for stability. One afternoon, Elise asked something she hadn't asked before. If I am required to leave, what happens to the child? Dr. Walsh didn't answer immediately. The child would remain, she said finally. Citizenship law is clear. Elise nodded, absorbing the meaning. Remain where? With whom? Stability was not guaranteed. It was being negotiated silently, daily. Anna Becker's challenge was visibility. Her marriage had placed her in a new category, no longer prisoner, not fully neighbor. When she attended town events, reactions varied. Some welcomed her with genuine warmth. Others measured distance carefully. At the schoolhouse, a teacher asked where she was from. Germany, Anna said. The pause lasted half a second too long. Oh, the teacher replied. Well, welcome. No hostility. No accusation. Just reminder. Katharina Vogel found resistance in forms and offices. Always procedural, always polite, always deniable. Applications delayed. Appointments rescheduled. Decisions postponed. She learned quickly that rejection didn't always come as no. Sometimes it came as not yet. The Callahan brothers absorbed it quietly. They did not argue. They did not demand. They simply stayed present. Stability, they believed, was built through consistency, not confrontation. Meanwhile, Washington sent another circular, not public, internal. Future prisoner labor assignments would be restricted. Domestic placements discouraged. Isolation increased. Hereford had become an example, not celebrated. Contained. Thomas Crawford received the memo in Dallas. He read it without surprise. This was the system correcting for discomfort, not for injustice. He realized then that Hereford would not be remembered officially for what it did right. It would be remembered for what it made people uneasy about. Crawford returned one final time before reassignment. He walked through town deliberately, observed interactions, watched who stood beside whom, who lingered, who hesitated. He noticed something else, too. The children. Children born after war did not carry suspicion naturally. They learned it. One afternoon, Crawford watched a small group of children playing near a fence. One of them, Elise's daughter, laughed freely, unaware of paperwork or borders or directives. That laugh carried weight. It represented a future no regulation had anticipated. Crawford met briefly with Dr. Walsh. "You protected them," he said. She corrected him gently. "I documented reality." That distinction mattered. At the Callahan Ranch, Daniel mentioned something quietly. They asked if we planned to leave Texas. Crawford looked up. "And we said no. But the question tells you enough." Yes, it did. Questions were becoming tools. Subtle ones, non-binding ones. But questions nonetheless. In March, final residency confirmations arrived. Stamped, signed, unceremonious. The outcomes were secured not because the system embraced them, but because reversing them would create more complexity than allowing them to stand. The children were born into legality, but not certainty. And yet life continued. By summer, routine softened the sharp edges. People adjusted. What once felt controversial became familiar. The extraordinary settled into ordinary. Crawford prepared to leave federal service. 2 years later, when he cleared his desk, he kept one copy of the Hereford file. Not officially, not logged. Personal. He understood now that not all victories looked like enforcement. Some looked like restraint. Some looked like choosing when not to act. As his train pulled away from Amarillo, Crawford watched the horizon flatten into distance. He had entered Hereford as an investigator. He left as something else, someone who knew that law without context could wound, and that sometimes the most consequential decision was not what you did, but what you chose not to destroy. What feels foreign eventually becomes a neighbor. The children went to school together. They played together. They grew up without the vocabulary to ate first, and that mattered more than any directive Washington had issued. Thomas Crawford retired quietly. No ceremony. No commendation. He declined interviews when journalists began circling stories of unusual wartime outcomes. He understood the danger of spectacle, how quickly nuance could be flattened into scandal or sentimentality. Some things, he believed, should remain unpolished. Years later, he would drive through Hereford again, not on assignment, not as an agent. Just a man passing through. He stopped at the same diner, ordered the same coffee, sat at the same counter. No one recognized him. That felt right. He watched families come in, Children laughing, ranchers talking about weather and cattle prices, life proceeding with no awareness of how fragile its foundations once were. As he left, he paused outside, letting the wind push against his coat. He realized something then. The investigation had never really ended. It had simply dissolved into outcomes. The law had not been enforced, but it had not been ignored either. It had been interpreted by people who understood that rules were meant to protect human dignity, not replace it. That realization stayed with him longer than any case he ever closed. Years passed. Stories faded, but some memories resisted time. Elise taught her daughter German songs not as nostalgia, but as honesty. Anna taught her son that history should be studied without excuses. Katharina taught hers that kindness did not require permission, and somewhere in a federal archive, a file remained quietly intact. Not famous, not referenced often, but complete. The war had ended with signatures and ceremonies. Peace, however, had been built slowly. In kitchens, in barns, in decisions made by ordinary people who chose not to reduce each other to categories. They did not think of themselves as heroes. They did not think they were rewriting history. They were simply responding to what was in front of them. A woman who needed safety. A child who needed stability. A future that needed restraint rather than force. That was the real legacy, not the scandal Washington feared. Not the silence it tried to maintain, but the proof that when systems hesitate, humanity often steps forward. And sometimes, that is enough.